Good morning. Our first scripture reading is from Exodus, chapter 1, verse 22, and chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, and you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds in the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." The word of the Lord.
My name is Jochebed, and I am Moses' mother. Though the story of my people is woven throughout the Old Testament, these few verses from Exodus are the only ones that you'll ever hear about me. That probably makes sense, I guess, because the story of the day that I let Moses go, floating down the river in his crude little ark, defined my whole life. I'd already had 2 children by the time Moses was born, his big brother Aaron and their big sister Miriam. Moses was indeed a fine baby. He was strong and healthy with those chubby little baby legs that make you melt just to look at them. He was a good sleeper, too, which was a small mercy after what we had experienced with Aaron. There was a stretch there where Aaron couldn't stay asleep for more than 45 minutes at a time. He'd wake up poor Miriam with his racket, and half the time all of us would be crying in frustration and exhaustion in the middle of the night. Moses was born during one of the most difficult periods in our people's lives. A new king had risen over Egypt, and his prejudice against us was violent. To this day, I'm not sure why he felt so threatened by us Hebrews, but his fear made him into a tyrant. The Egyptians thought he was a god, but he turned us into slaves. He was ruthless in the kinds of things that he forced us to do, but nothing struck terror into my heart like his efforts to wipe out our people. Every Hebrew woman knows the story of the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who refused to comply with Pharaoh's order that every baby boy born to a Hebrew woman be killed. When he realized that the midwives' respect for God was larger than their fear of him, Pharaoh sent out a decree to all the Egyptian people, commanding that every baby boy born to a Hebrew woman be taken from her and drowned in the Nile. When it was time for Moses to be born, my sisters helped me deliver him in secret. And thanks to God's mercy, I was somehow able to hide him from the Egyptians for a few months. But the shrieks and wiggles of a 3-month-old baby are much harder to hide than the cries of a newborn. Pharaoh's soldiers were patrolling every day, and I would not let my baby be taken from me. So I prayed anguished prayers, begging God to give me the strength to go through with the only plan that I could come up with that might give Moses a chance at life. I waterproofed a little basket with tar and pitch and walked with Moses and Miriam down to the Nile. I placed Moses into the basket, lowering it gently into the same river that was supposed to ensure his death. He seemed to like the feel of floating in the water, and he smiled up at me. I choked back my tears and forced myself to smile back at him, and then I positioned the basket in the direction of Pharaoh's palace. I hated the mere sight of that palace, but if there was any hope for my son, it would lie in an Egyptian woman, a servant girl, or maybe even Pharaoh's own daughter, who might be moved to compassion at the sight of him. And so, clutching Miriam's hand, I let Moses go. Miriam ran down the bank of the river to watch where the basket would end up, but I could not bear the sight of my baby boy floating away from me. As soon as Miriam was out of sight, I collapsed onto the ground, heaving sobs through a grief so thick and heavy that I was worried it might choke me. I've had people wonder aloud about how I could do such a thing, how I could give my baby up to danger and uncertainty like that. The question feels sort of strange to me now. I mean, I was forced into that excruciating decision by the Pharaoh's regime, but don't we all do the same thing eventually? Whether we are a parent or a grandparent, a sister or a brother, an aunt or an uncle or a teacher or a friend who is as close as family, don't we all eventually have to let go of the children we love so that maybe, just maybe, they might live? You're listening from thousands of years into the future, so you already know what I could not have known on the day that I let Moses go. Moses' basket ended up in the reeds near where the Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. She sent one of her maids to get it, and when she saw my baby boy, who had to have been crying by then, she took pity on him, and she picked him up out of the water. I didn't know anything about the Pharaoh's daughter except what was obvious. She was a young woman of great wealth and great privilege. She had to have known of the horrible plan her father had enacted, because not even the palace walls were thick enough to keep out the shrieks and the cries of the grieving Hebrew women as their baby boys were taken from them. She could have just as easily turned Moses' basket upside down and walked away in disgust. She could have chosen loyalty to the system that put every comfort within her reach, but instead she broke the chain of racism and prejudice that fueled her father's tyranny. Looking into that basket, she was somehow able to see my son for what he was, a tiny, helpless baby whose life mattered. And in that moment, she made the choice to use her privilege not as a weapon, but as a tool. Her choice saved my son, and it also saved me. Or maybe it's better to say that God saved me, because truly, isn't this how God has chosen to work salvation throughout human history? Hasn't the saving power of God been carried through generations by the everyday choices of human beings whose lives get tangled up together? My daughter Miriam was a clever, intuitive child who always seemed to have a special kind of connection with God. She loved her baby brother, and she loved me. Though she was too young to really understand everything that was happening on the day that we let Moses go into the river, her instinct to follow the basket is eventually what resulted in my baby being returned to me, at least for a short time. Miriam saw the Pharaoh's daughter pick Moses up out of the water, and as Pharaoh's daughter and her maids started walking back toward the palace, Miriam put herself in their path. She overheard them wondering about how they were going to feed this infant, and somehow Miriam had the presence of mind to say, "Would you like me to go find a Hebrew woman to nurse him for you?" The Pharaoh's daughter said yes, and so Miriam ran back to find me. My eyes were red from sobbing, and I had to pull myself together to even understand what Miriam was saying. But when we walked back toward the young women, the Pharaoh's daughter handed Moses back to me. I nursed him for 2 years before giving him back to the woman who had saved him from the river, and she adopted him as her own. I've lived long enough to know that these moments of grace don't punctuate every experience of excruciating grief and loss. Life isn't a fairy tale, and sometimes things unravel in wildly unfair ways. Sometimes life comes apart so violently that it makes us curse the very God who made us. I understand that. And to be honest, I think God understands it too. The creator of the sun and the moon and the stars is most certainly big enough to handle whatever we scream at him from the darkest nights of our own soul. It's okay. You are not beyond the great weaver's grasp. My son was born during one of the most difficult periods of our people's lives. He was born into a world that no mother would ever dream for her child. And it took God working through the interwoven lives of 5 women to give him a chance at life at all. I'm grateful to the midwives, Shifra and Pua, who subverted the Pharaoh's plan to wipe out an entire generation of Hebrew boys. I'm grateful to my daughter, Miriam, who followed after her baby brother and could witness to his safety. It took me a long time to say this, but I'm also grateful to Pharaoh's daughter, who chose to use her power to save a baby whom she had been told was her enemy. And I am grateful for the courage that God gave to me, his mother, to make not the right choice, not the best choice, but the only choice available to me given the circumstances. God worked through all 5 of us to save Moses, and God later worked through Moses to free us all from the slavery and oppression that marked this horrific time in our people's history. I know that this is a difficult time in your people's history too. I know that so many of you have watched your own plans for the lives of the children you love unravel into heaps before you. The ongoing pandemic is really just the beginning of it. With little power to do much more than hold those children with tender strength, you have watched so many things tear at the fragile threads of their young lives. I don't think it's fair or faithful to reassure you that everything is going to be okay, because too much of life is just beyond our control and beyond our knowing. I don't know what life holds for the children in your life, for the children of this congregation. But if my life has taught me anything, it has taught me this, beyond a shadow of a doubt: our God is faithful. The story of my baby boy is just one small thread in a whole tapestry of salvation stories. Salvation stories that culminate in the one that you know best, the story of Jesus. In Jesus, we see a God who knows what it is to love beyond all limits. In Jesus, we see a God who knows what it is to suffer. And in Jesus, we also see a God who knows what it is to find resurrection, and who is leading us to new life as well, always, even if we can't quite see it yet. Thanks be to God.